Let me begin by saying that for as long as I can remember, the ability to perceive spirits and otherworldly entities has run through my family like an invisible thread, tying us to the strange and supernatural. This uncanny sensitivity seems to manifest most strongly on my father's side, tracing back generations to my great-great-grandmother Esther, a formidable woman rumored to possess second sight. Family lore is rife with hushed tales of Esther's eerie premonitions of how she could divine a person's secrets with a single penetrating look. As a child, I delighted in these stories of my spooky ancestress, begging my father to recount them over and over until I could recite them by heart. It was my father who first discovered his own psychic gift when he was just 12 years old. The way he told it, he had been exploring the dense woods behind his parents' farmhouse, following the erratic flittings of a blue morpho butterfly. The day was hot and still, the air thick with the drone of cicadas. As he pushed deeper into the green gloom, ducking under low-hanging branches festooned with lacy curtains of Spanish moss, a sudden chill prickled his spine. The hairs on his arms stood at attention and his breath plumed before him despite the muggy heat. He froze, some primal instinct screaming danger. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, he turned his head. There, hovering between two gnarled oaks, was the translucent figure of a woman. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, high-collared and severe. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She stared at him across the decades with mournful, luminous eyes, her pale hands clasped before her. As he gaped in shock, she slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest, before shimmering out of existence like mist under the sun. Heart threatening to pound out of his chest, my father considered fleeing back to the safety of home, but curiosity and a strange magnetic pull drew him onward in the direction the specter had indicated. Barely 50 yards from where she had appeared, he stumbled into a small clearing. Sunlight filtered greenly through the leaves, dappling the forest floor in gold and shadow. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a small, unmarked grave. A roughly hewn wooden cross tilted drunkenly to one side, the only marker of the body laid to rest beneath the loamy earth. That was the first ghost my father ever saw, but it was far from the last. As he grew older, he learned to hone his extrasensory perception, to attune himself to the subtle energies and auras that swirled unseen around people and places. His reputation as a powerful medium spread, first in whispers through our small Ohio town, then to neighboring counties and beyond. People sought him out for spiritual guidance, to communicate with departed loved ones, to cleanse homes and businesses of negative energies. He accepted it all with calm grace and a quiet, unshakable faith in his purpose. By the time I came along, my father had fully embraced his identity as a psychic counselor and paranormal investigator. Some of my earliest memories are of strangers appearing at our front door, their eyes haunted and their voices trembling as they begged for my father's help. He always welcomed them in, listened to their stories with grave empathy, and did his best to provide aid and comfort. I would watch from the stairs, my small hands gripping the balustrade as he would sit with them in our cozy living room, holding their hands and gazing into the distance with a look of intense concentration. Sometimes, late at night, I would sneak out of bed and creep halfway down the stairs, straining to catch snatches of the adult conversations drifting up from below. The otherworldly tales I overheard thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. Banshees keening in the night, poltergeists hurling furniture, shadow figures looming in dark hallways. My child's mind transformed them into delicious horrors, campfire stories to whisper to my wide-eyed friends on muggy summer nights. But it wasn't all second-hand supernatural excitement. I had my own brushes with the unknown, fleeting moments that hinted at the psychic sensitivity I had inherited. Objects would inexplicably move overnight in my room, my favorite stuffed animals arranged in a tidy circle on the floor. Ethereal wisps, like curls of pale smoke, would dance in my peripheral vision. And then there were the dreams, vivid, intense, and saturated with eerie symbolism. I would wake panting and drenched in icy sweat, the details already evaporating in the light of dawn. It all came to a head in the summer of 1985 when I was 9 years old. We had just moved to the ramshackle old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a behemoth of weathered wood and sagging gutters set on 10 acres of sprawling woods and fields. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, the night so dark and still you could imagine you were the last person on earth. To me it was heaven, a wild expanse to roam, trees to climb, and more freedom than I had ever known. My little sister Lily, just 7 at the time, was more hesitant about our new rural home. She missed her friends from our old neighborhood and the bustle of town. The country quiet unnerved her, the vast open spaces seeming more eerie than peaceful. She stuck close to the house those first few weeks, a small pale ghost peering out the windows. Dad, for his part, seemed energized by the move. He had a new lightness in his step, a gleam in his eye as he talked about the good energy of the place. Looking back, I suspect the isolation appealed to him, the freedom to fully engage in his unconventional work without prying eyes and wagging tongues. He could meet with clients in privacy, perform intense spiritual workings without worrying about the neighbors. I think it was that very isolation, that veil of secrecy, that allowed the darkness to take root. It began slowly, subtly, like a drop of black ink swirling into a glass of clear water. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Creaks and groans in the night that could be attributed to the old house settling. Sudden chills that pebbled our skin, there and gone in a heartbeat. Lily, hollow-eyed and listless, pushing her breakfast around her plate without eating. Then came the whispering, soft, sibilant, like leaves skittering across a cold ground. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, the empty spaces in the shadows. I would freeze, straining to make out words in the white noise hiss. It never rose above a murmur, but it filled me with formless dread, a bone-deep certainty that the whispers harbored ancient malice. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it to Dad, he frowned, that familiar crease appearing between his eyebrows. He tilted his head as if listening for something beyond the range of normal human hearing. After a long, taut moment, his shoulders relaxed and he smiled reassuringly. "It's nothing to worry about, son. Just the spirit of a little girl making her presence known. She drowned in the pond out back decades ago, poor thing. But she means no harm. She's just a bit of a trickster, that's all." I wanted to believe him. I clung to the comfort of his words like a life raft in the chilly sea of my own fear, and for a while it worked. Dad's calm confidence was a balm, his explanations a candle in the dark. We even gave the spirit a cute nickname, Abby, short for Abigail. Abby's shenanigans were unsettling but relatively innocuous at first. Lights would flicker and dim, bulbs burning out with startling regularity. Our milk would spoil overnight, souring in the fridge despite the cold. Doors would open and shut themselves, their hinges shrieking like damned souls. It became a macabre sort of routine, just another quirk of our eccentric home. But as the sticky Ohio summer crept on, Abby's tricks took on a sharper edge. Lily's dolls would end up arranged in disturbing tableaus, their glassy eyes staring accusingly from high shelves. Angry welts would appear on our skin as we slept, vivid red scratches like the marks of small fingernails. And over it all hung the cloying stench of stagnant water, the thick scent of the pond on a breezeless day. Through it all, Dad remained unflappable, his faith in his spectral abilities absolute. When I came to him in near tears after a particularly vicious nightmare, he gathered me into a tight hug and stroked my hair. "Abby's just trying to get attention, kiddo, like any child acting out. We have to show her love and understanding, prove that we're not scared of her. She'll come around, you'll see." I nodded against his chest, breathing in the comforting scent of his aftershave. I wanted so badly for him to be right. But deep in my young bones, an ancestral knowing whispered that something was very, very wrong. Everything came to a terrifying head on a sweltering night in late August. The air was thick and soupy, the crickets and frogs symphonic in the darkness. I lay restless atop sweat-damp sheets, the old box fan in the window providing little relief. Tossing and turning, I tried to ignore the uneasiness trickling along my nerves like icy fingers. The clock ticked over to 3 a.m., the witching hour. At that precise moment, an ungodly scream tore through the house. It was high and ragged with terror, a woman's voice on the ragged edge of sanity. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was coming from Lily's room. I was out of bed in an instant, my bare feet slapping against the worn wood floors. I burst through Lily's door, heart lodged somewhere in my throat. My sister was sitting bolt upright in bed, her dark hair plastered to her forehead in lank strands. Her eyes were huge in the pale oval of her face, stark terror in every line of her small body. "Lily, what's wrong? What happened?" My words came out high and panicky, my breath sawing in my throat. Slowly, tremulously, she raised a quivering hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. I followed the line of her finger, a leaden weight settling in my gut. There, crouched in the gloom where the feeble moonlight failed to reach, was a shape. It was vaguely human in outline, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and its head bulbous and misshapen. As I stared in horrified fascination, it unfolded from its contorted crouch with a liquid, boneless grace that turned my stomach. It seemed to absorb the darkness around it like a stain spreading in reverse. Then, as if sensing my gaze, its head snapped up with a cracking speed that defied physics. 2 pinprick points of baleful red light glared out of the writhing shadows of its face, piercing me to the core. Malevolence and a terrible ancient hunger rolled off the thing in palpable waves, pressing down on my mind like the crushing pressure in the deep ocean. I opened my mouth to scream for my father, but my throat was paralyzed, my lungs seized in bands of ice. I could only stand rooted to the spot in mute horror as the entity slowly unfurled to its full imposing height. The shadows peeled away from it like flayed skin, revealing pallid, grayish flesh stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Straggles of lank dark hair hung in a parody of a child's style. But it was the eyes that shattered me, crimson wells of inhuman rage and bottomless sorrow. No child's eyes had ever looked like that, held that fathomless well of despair. It took a single gliding step towards us, its movements jerky and puppet-like. That was all it took to break the spell holding me immobile. Galvanized by pure primal terror, I grabbed Lily's icy hand and ran, yanking her behind me hard enough to draw a yelp. We flew down the dark hall to our parents' room, literally falling through the door. Dad was already up, his face lined with concern in the glow of the bedside lamp. Mom, her dark hair tumbling around her shoulders, clutched the quilt with white-knuckled fingers. "What in the world?" Dad started, but his words cut off as he registered our wild eyes, the stark fear etched into every line of our bodies. "It's Abby," I gasped out. "But she's not right, Dad. That thing in Lily's room, it's not human, it's evil, it's..." My voice cracked and dissolved on a sob. Lily pressed against my side, small and shaking. Dad's face hardened, a steely resolve settling over his features. He turned to my mother, some wordless communication passing between them. "Stay with the kids," he said grimly, already moving towards the door. For the first time I could remember, real fear shadowed his eyes. It made him look older, more vulnerable. Just a man, not the unshakable pillar of strength I had always seen him as. Mom wrapped her arms around us as Dad slipped from the room, a sense of something momentous and terrible looming in the musty air. I remember the sound of his footsteps receding down the hall, the creak of the floorboards like bones straining under a malignant weight. The silence that followed was a heavy, watchful thing, gravid with unspeakable possibilities. 1 minute became 2, then 5, then 10. The night pressed close, a smothering black void hungering to consume us. I shivered in my mother's embrace, chilled to the marrow despite the sticky heat. When the scream came, it was a blade straight to the heart. High and agonized, It ripped through the deathly hush like a serrated knife. I will never forget that sound, the sheer animal pain and terror of it. It was my father's voice, but twisted into something raw and unrecognizable. Mom was already moving, shoving us behind her and scrabbling frantically in the bedside drawer. Her hand emerged, clutching a small silver crucifix, the metal winking coldly in the lamplight. Lips moving in soundless prayer, she advanced towards the door, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a gale. And the darkness answered. A frigid wind howled through the house, rattling the windows in their frames and slamming doors with a violence that shook the very foundations. The temperature plummeted with a startling abruptness, our breaths pluming before us in panicked puffs. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking on grotesque shapes that gibbered and danced in the flickering light. The stench of rot and fetid water rose like a miasma, clogging the back of my throat with cloying sweetness. Despair crashed over me in a black wave, the bone-deep certainty that all hope was lost, that we were tiny, insignificant creatures caught in the maw of something vast and utterly malign. In that moment of soul-crushing hopelessness, as the darkness closed in like a fist, and the unearthly screams of my father echoed in my ears, something shifted inside me. A small, bright spark of defiance kindled to life in my chest, a stubborn flicker that refused to be snuffed out. It was the ember at the core of me, the inherited strength of my father and his father before him, a legacy of those who stared into the abyss and refused to blink. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I grabbed the silver crucifix from my mother's numb fingers. Its weight was reassuring in my palm, the metal warming to my touch. I squared my narrow shoulders and stepped towards the roiling mass of shadows blocking the door, heart pounding a war drum in my chest. "Leave us alone." The words tore out of me in a ragged shout, my voice cracking with the force of my terror and desperate bravery. "You're not welcome here, Abby, or whatever you are. This is our home, and you can't have it, or us." I thrust the crucifix out before me, my small hand shaking but resolute. For a moment the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears and the rasp of my rapid breaths. The shadows stilled, the unnatural wind dying as suddenly as it had risen. Then, like oil fleeing from water, the darkness began to recede. It peeled back from the walls and door, slinking away into the far corners of the room. As it withdrew, as the darkness receded, I caught a glimpse of what lay beyond the door, out in the hallway. My father lay crumpled against the far wall, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Blood matted his hair and pooled beneath him in a dark, viscous puddle. For a moment the world tilted dizzyingly on its axis and I thought I might pass out. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the flutter of his eyelids, and relief crashed through me like a tidal wave. He was alive, badly hurt, but alive. In that moment the last of the shadows vanished, taking with them the unnatural cold and the reek of stagnant water. The house was still and quiet, the only sound the ragged sawing of our collective breathing. I realized I was still holding the crucifix before me, my knuckles white around its silver length. Slowly, hardly daring to believe it was truly over, I lowered my trembling arm. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the acrid scent of antiseptic. Paramedics, police, a horde of grim-faced men in dark suits who spoke in low, clipped tones. Through it all, we huddled together in shocked silence, watching our cozy world come undone at the seams. In the end, there was no tidy explanation, no easy answers to wrap up the horror in a neat bow. The official report spoke of a disturbed transient, a tragic home invasion with an almost supernatural edge. But we knew the truth, a truth too dark and strange for the harsh light of day. In the weeks that followed, as Dad recovered from his injuries, and we struggled to pick up the tattered pieces of our lives, I threw myself into research with a fervor bordering on obsession. Long nights in the library, poring over dusty tomes and faded newspaper clippings, seeking any scrap of information about the history of our land, the restless spirits that called it home. What I uncovered chilled me to the bone. Tales of settlers vanishing without a trace, of dark rituals and blood-soaked soil, whispers of a malevolent entity older than human memory, a darkness that hungered for the innocent, and threading through it all a familiar theme, a little girl, dark-haired and doomed, her tragic fate forever binding her to this cursed place. With each new revelation, the icy claws of dread sank deeper into my heart. I knew with a grim, unshakable certainty that our ordeal was far from over. The evil we had faced was merely a harbinger, a taste of the darkness to come. It had marked us, claimed us in some fundamental way, and it would never let us go. But even as despair threatened to consume me, I clung to the memory of that small, defiant spark that had ignited within me in our darkest hour. The legacy of my father's courage, the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. I knew that wherever this twisted path might lead, whatever fresh horrors lay in wait, we would face them as we always had, together as a family, drawing strength from the unbreakable bonds of blood and love. Our battle was just beginning, but we would not face it alone. In the coming years, as I honed my abilities and delved ever deeper into the world of the unseen, I would find others like myself, gifted, cursed, bound by the eternal struggle against the forces of darkness. Together we would stand as a light in the shadows, a bulwark against the hungry void that sought to consume us all. The road ahead was long and shrouded in uncertainty, but I knew one thing with bone-deep conviction. Whatever trials lay in store, whatever sacrifices demanded, I would never stop fighting. For my father, for Lily, for the innocent and the lost. I would take up the mantle passed down through generations, the sacred duty to defend the living from the depredations of the dead. I was a child no longer, but a soldier in an ancient war. My weapons would be salt and silver, sage and blessed steel. My strength, the love and faith of those who stood beside me. And though the darkness might press close, though the night seem endless and filled with teeth, I would never forget the lesson of that fateful summer. Even in the deepest shadows, there is always a spark of light, a glimmer of hope, fragile yet indomitable. And it is from these sparks that the greatest fires are born, the cleansing flames that chase the darkness back and remind us of who we are, children of the sun, unbowed and unafraid. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night of babysitting. How could I have known that it would turn into the most terrifying experience of my young life? My name is Emily, and I'm a 17-year-old high school student living in the quiet suburban town of Maplewood. Like many teenagers, I picked up babysitting gigs to earn some extra cash, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that fateful night at the Thompson house. It was a crisp autumn evening when I received the text from Mrs. Thompson. Her message was brief but friendly, asking if I was available to watch her kids the following Friday night. I smiled as I read it, already looking forward to spending time with Chris and Lily. The Thompsons weren't just any family in the neighborhood. They were practically an extension of my own. My younger sister Sarah was best friends with their son Chris. At 10 years old, Chris was a bundle of energy with a mischievous glint in his eye that reminded me of my own brother at that age. But it was his little sister Lily who had truly captured my heart. Lily was only 6, a tiny pixie of a girl with golden curls and the biggest blue eyes you've ever seen. From the moment I first met her, I was smitten. She had this way of looking at you like you were the most important person in the world, and her giggle was infectious. Whenever I babysat for the Thompsons, Lily would follow me around like a little shadow, hanging on my every word and begging me to play dolls or dress up with her. I quickly texted Mrs. Thompson back, confirming that I was free and happy to watch the kids. She responded almost immediately with the details. She'd be going out for dinner with friends and wouldn't be back until late. It was nothing out of the ordinary, and I was genuinely looking forward to it. The rest of the week passed in a blur of classes, homework, and after-school activities. Before I knew it, Friday had arrived. I remember standing in front of my closet that afternoon, deliberating over what to wear. It might seem silly now, given what was to come, but at the time, my biggest concern was whether to go with my favorite cozy sweater or a more practical t-shirt for playing with the kids. I settled on the sweater, a soft, oversized thing in a warm shade of burgundy, paired with my most comfortable jeans and sneakers. As I braided my long dark hair, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. Green eyes stared back at me, filled with the confidence of youth. I had no idea that in just a few hours those same eyes would be wide with terror. Grabbing my phone and a backpack filled with some books and art supplies for the kids, I headed downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the rest of the family. "Heading out, sweetie?" she asked, looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Yeah, babysitting for the Thompsons tonight," I replied, snagging an apple from the fruit bowl. "I probably won't be back until late." My mom nodded, a small frown creasing her forehead. "Just be careful, okay? It's supposed to storm later." I rolled my eyes good-naturedly. "Mom, the Thompson house is literally 2 streets over. I think I'll survive." She chuckled, shaking her head. I know. I'm just being a mom. Have fun, and call if you need anything." With a quick hug and a promise to text when I got there, I was out the door. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. As I walked down our tree-lined street, I noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Maybe my mom was right about that storm. The walk to the Thompson house was short and familiar. I'd made this trip countless times before, both for babysitting and just to hang out. Their house was a beautiful Victorian-style home, painted a cheery yellow with white trim. As I approached, I could see warm light spilling from the windows, creating a cozy, inviting atmosphere. I climbed the porch steps and rang the doorbell, hearing the muffled chimes echo inside. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Mrs. Thompson. She was dressed elegantly in a black cocktail dress, her blonde hair swept up in a stylish updo. "Emily, thank you so much for coming," she said warmly, ushering me inside. "The kids are so excited you're here." No sooner had the words left her mouth than I heard the thunder of little feet on the stairs. Chris appeared first, taking the steps 2 at a time in his eagerness. "Emily!" he shouted, launching himself at me for a hug. I laughed, catching him and ruffling his hair. "Hey, buddy, ready for some fun tonight?" He nodded enthusiastically, already starting to ramble about a new video game he wanted to show me. But my attention was quickly drawn to the small figure that had appeared at the top of the stairs. Lily stood there in her favorite princess nightgown, her blonde curls a messy halo around her head. When she saw me, her entire face lit up with a smile that could melt the coldest heart. "Emmy," she squealed, carefully making her way down the stairs. I knelt down, opening my arms, and she flew into them, burying her face in my neck. "Hey there, little fairy," I murmured, using the nickname I'd given her long ago. "I missed you." Mrs. Thompson watched our reunion with a fond smile. "As you can see, they're thrilled you're here. I've left money for pizza on the kitchen counter, and all the emergency numbers are on the fridge. I should be back around midnight, but I'll text if I'm running late." I nodded, already well versed in the routine. "We'll be fine, Mrs. Thompson. Have a great time tonight." She thanked me again, kissed both kids goodbye, and with a final wave, was out the door. As it closed behind her, I turned to Chris and Lily, grinning. "All right, munchkins, who's ready for some fun?" Their excited cheers filled the house, and I felt a surge of affection for these kids I'd come to love so much. If only I had known then what the night had in store for us. Maybe I would have grabbed them both and run far, far away from that house. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. And so, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited us, I led Chris and Lily into the living room to begin what I thought would be just another night of games, laughter, and innocent fun. Little did I know that by the end of the night my entire world would be turned upside down, and I would question everything I thought I knew about reality. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the nightmare was about to begin. The first few hours of the evening passed in a whirlwind of activity. Chris was eager to show me his progress in the latest Minecraft world he'd been building, so we all gathered around the family computer in the den. I sat in the chair with Lily perched on my lap and Chris standing beside us, excitedly pointing out all the new features he'd added since I'd last seen it. "Look, Emily, I built a huge castle with a moat and everything," Chris exclaimed, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he navigated through his virtual world. I made appropriately impressed noises, genuinely amazed at the creativity and effort he'd put into his creation. Lily, not wanting to be left out, kept trying to grab the mouse. "I want to play too," she insisted, her little face scrunched up in determination. "How about we take turns?" I suggested, always the diplomat. "Chris can show us his world for a little bit longer, and then we can switch to a game we can all play together. Sound fair?" Both kids agreed, though Lily's pout suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the arrangement. To distract her, I started pointing out different aspects of Chris's world, asking her what she thought about them. Soon enough, she was just as engaged as her brother, gasping in delight when Chris showed us the unicorn stable he'd built, especially for Lily. After about an hour of Minecraft, true to my word, I suggested we switch to a game we could all enjoy together. We ended up settling on Mario Kart, which quickly devolved into a raucous competition filled with shrieks of laughter and playful accusations of cheating. "No fair," Chris yelled as Lily's character zipped past his on the screen. "How did you get so good at this?" Lily just giggled, her little tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth as she concentrated on the game. I couldn't help but laugh at their antics, my heart full of affection for these two. As we played, I noticed the wind starting to pick up outside. The trees visible through the living room window were swaying more vigorously, their leaves rustling in a way that seemed almost ominous. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed a few seconds later by a low rumble of thunder. Lily immediately tensed up, her eyes wide. "I don't like storms," she whispered, scooting closer to me on the couch. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay, sweetie, we're safe inside. How about we order that pizza now? I don't know about you two, but I'm getting pretty hungry." The prospect of food seemed to cheer Lily up, and Chris was quick to chime in with his topping preferences. We paused the game and made our way to the kitchen, where I found the money Mrs. Thompson had left for dinner. As I dialed the local pizza place, Chris and Lily began a heated debate about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. "It's yucky," Lily declared, wrinkling her nose. "No way. It's the best," Chris argued back. "Sweet and salty together. It's perfect." I couldn't help but smile at their passionate disagreement over something so trivial. If only I had known then that in just a few short hours, pizza toppings would be the least of our concerns. With the pizza ordered, half cheese for Lily, half Hawaiian for Chris, much to Lily's disgust, we decided to pass the time until it arrived by drawing. I pulled out the art supplies I'd brought in my backpack, and soon the kitchen table was covered in colorful drawings. Chris was working on an intricate battle scene, complete with dragons and knights, while Lily focused all her attention on creating what she informed me was a fairy princess unicorn. I sketched absent-mindedly, letting my mind wander as I enjoyed the peaceful moment. As I watched the kids, I found myself thinking about how quickly they were growing up. It seemed like just yesterday that Lily was a toddler, barely able to hold a crayon. Now here she was, creating recognizable, if fantastical, figures. And Chris, I could remember when he and my sister were just starting kindergarten, and now they were on the cusp of middle school. A particularly loud crack of thunder made us all jump, breaking the calm atmosphere. Lily dropped her crayon, her lower lip trembling. "Hey, it's okay," I soothed, reaching out to stroke her hair. "It's just a big noise, that's all. Nothing to be afraid of." Chris, in a show of big brotherly concern that warmed my heart, scooted his chair closer to Lily's. "Yeah, don't be scared, Lil. I'll protect you." Lily managed a wobbly smile at that, picking up her crayon again, but I could see her hand shaking slightly as she continued to draw. The doorbell rang, making us all start again. "That must be the pizza," I said, standing up. "I'll be right back." As I walked to the front door, I couldn't shake off a strange feeling of unease. Maybe it was just the storm, or maybe I was picking up on Lily's fear, but something felt off. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. I was letting my imagination run wild, that was all. I opened the door to find a drenched delivery guy holding our pizza. "Rough night out there," he commented as I took the boxes and handed him the money. "Yeah, looks like it," I replied, glancing past him at the rain-slicked street. The wind was really howling now, bending the trees at an alarming angle. "Drive safe, okay?" He nodded his thanks and hurried back to his car. As I closed the door, I couldn't help but feel relieved to be inside, safe from the storm. If only I had known then that the real danger wasn't outside, but right here in this house with us. I carried the pizzas back to the kitchen, where Chris and Lily were already clearing away their art supplies in anticipation of dinner. Their excited chatter as they opened the boxes and the familiar, comforting smell of pizza helped to dispel some of my unease. We ate our dinner at the kitchen table, the storm providing a dramatic backdrop to our meal. Between bites, Chris regaled us with stories from school, while Lily interjected with her own, often only tangentially related anecdotes. I listened and laughed, treasuring these moments of normalcy and innocence. As we finished eating, I glanced at the clock. It was nearing 9 p.m., the kids' bedtime. I braced myself for the usual protests, but to my surprise, both Chris and Lily seemed more subdued than usual. "You two about ready for bed?" I asked cautiously, half expecting an outburst. Chris yawned widely, nodding. "Yeah, I'm pretty tired." Lily, who had been unusually quiet for the last few minutes, simply held her arms up to me. "Carry me, Emmy." I scooped her up, feeling a twinge of concern at how subdued she was. "You feeling okay, little fairy?" She nodded against my shoulder, but didn't say anything else. Chris trudged up the stairs ahead of us, his usual boundless energy seeming to have deserted him. As I helped them both get ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Both kids were far too compliant, none of their usual stall tactics or pleas for just 5 more minutes. I told myself it was probably just the excitement of the evening combined with the storm that had worn them out, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that there was more to it than that. I tucked Lily into bed first, smoothing her curls back from her forehead. "Sweet dreams, little fairy," I murmured, pressing a kiss to her cheek. She grabbed my hand as I turned to leave. "Emmy?" Her voice was small, almost scared. "Can you leave the light on?" "Of course, sweetheart," I assured her, flicking on her bedside lamp. "I'll be right downstairs if you need anything, okay?" She nodded, her eyes already drooping closed. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching her. In the soft glow of the lamp, she looked so small, so vulnerable. A fierce wave of protectiveness washed over me. Next, I checked on Chris. He was already in bed, his eyes closed, but I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't asleep yet. "You okay, buddy?" I asked softly. He opened one eye, peering at me. "Yeah, just tired. Good night, Emily." "Good night, Chris. Sleep well." As I closed his door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Both kids had gone to bed far too easily, especially given the excitement of having me there and the drama of the storm outside. But what could I do? They were in bed, apparently ready to sleep. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I made my way back downstairs, the house suddenly feeling much larger and emptier without the kids' presence. The storm was still raging outside, wind howling around the eaves of the house and rain lashing against the windows. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as I walked into the living room. Settling onto the couch, I pulled out my phone and opened Netflix, searching for something to watch. I needed a distraction from the storm and the strange unease that had settled over me. I finally settled on a familiar sitcom, hoping the laugh track and predictable jokes would help calm my nerves. As the opening theme played, I glanced at the grandfather clock standing against the wall near the TV. Its steady ticking was oddly comforting, a reminder that time was still moving forward normally, despite. As I sat there on the couch trying to lose myself in the mindless comedy on the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt different somehow, as if the very air had changed. I told myself it was just the storm, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house as it was buffeted by wind and rain. But deep down I knew it was more than that. I had just started to relax, laughing at a particularly ridiculous joke on the show, when I heard it. Footsteps, coming down the stairs. My heart leapt into my throat. I muted the TV, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of small feet descending the staircase. I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Chris? Lily? Is that you?" No answer. Just the continued sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Guys, this isn't funny. If you're up, you need to go back to bed." Still no response. The footsteps had stopped. I turned around, facing the staircase behind the couch. It was empty. There was no sign of either child. A chill ran down my spine. Had I imagined it? Was the storm playing tricks on my mind? That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the grandfather clock, there was a figure, the faint outline of a little girl, leaning over the railing of the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. It had to be Lily. Who else could it be? I spun around, ready to scold her for being out of bed. But the staircase was empty. There was no one there. Confusion and fear warred within me. I looked back at the grandfather clock, but the reflection was gone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to have been a trick of the light, right? Maybe a shadow cast by the TV, or a reflection of something else in the room. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen had been clear, unmistakable. A little girl, leaning over the railing. A girl who wasn't there when I turned around. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock and the storm raging outside. Finally, I forced myself to move. I had to check on the kids. I had to make sure they were okay. My legs felt like lead as I approached the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. As I ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I resisted the urge to look behind me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only light coming from the nightlight plugged in near the bathroom. The doors to both kids' rooms were closed, just as I'd left them. I approached Chris's room first, my hand shaking slightly as I reached for the doorknob. I opened the door as quietly as I could, peering inside. Chris was there, sound asleep in his bed. His chest rose and fell with deep, even breaths. He hadn't moved since I'd tucked him in. Relief washed over me. Whatever I'd heard, whatever I'd seen, it wasn't Chris. I closed his door gently and turned to Lily's room. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just Lily. Sweet, innocent Lily. There was nothing to be afraid of. I opened her door, stepping into the room. The bedside lamp was still on, casting a warm glow over the space. And there, in the bed, was Lily. Fast asleep, her golden curls spread out on the pillow like a halo. I moved closer just to be sure. Yes, she was definitely asleep. Her little face was relaxed, her breathing deep and regular. She hadn't been out of bed. She couldn't have been. But if it wasn't Chris and it wasn't Lily, what had I seen? I backed out of the room, closing the door quietly behind me. My mind was reeling. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the storm and the creaky old house were playing tricks on me. I made my way back downstairs, my eyes darting around nervously. Everything looked normal. The living room was just as I'd left it, the muted TV still flickering with images from the sitcom. I sank back onto the couch, my legs feeling weak. I should call Mrs. Thompson, I thought, or my mom, someone who could reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. But what would I say? That I'd seen a ghost? That I'd heard footsteps when both kids were asleep in their beds? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd think I wasn't capable of watching the kids. No, I decided. I would keep this to myself. It was probably nothing. Just my imagination running wild in a dark, stormy house. I unmuted the TV, turning up the volume slightly. The familiar laugh track and cheesy jokes were comforting, grounding me in reality. I forced myself to focus on the show, to push the unsettling experience out of my mind. But as I sat there trying to lose myself in the mindless entertainment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt different now, as if some barrier had been crossed, some door opened that couldn't be closed again. And deep down, in a part of my mind I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever I had seen, whatever presence I had felt, it wasn't done with me yet. The storm continued to rage outside, but now it felt like a backdrop to a much more personal, much more terrifying drama that was just beginning to unfold. And I was trapped here, responsible for 2 sleeping children with no idea of what was coming next. I glanced at the clock. It was only 10:30 p.m. Mrs. Thompson wouldn't be home for hours yet. I had never felt so alone, so vulnerable in my life. Little did I know the true terror was yet to come. Time seemed to crawl as I sat there on the couch, my eyes flicking between the TV screen and the staircase. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I was on edge, hyper-aware of every sound and movement. It must have been around 11:15 when it happened again. I had just started to relax, convincing myself that what I'd seen earlier was just a product of an overactive imagination. That's when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement reflected in the TV screen. I whipped my head around, my heart in my throat. For a split second, I saw her again. The little girl in the white nightgown standing at the bottom of the stairs. But this time, something was different. Her face, it wasn't Lily's face. It was pale, too pale, with dark hollows where her eyes should have been. I blinked and she was gone. A scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. But as I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. No signal. How could there be no signal? I always had perfect reception in this house. That's when the lights started to flicker. It was subtle at first, just a slight dimming that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been so on edge. But it quickly became more pronounced. The lights pulsed, growing brighter and then dimmer in an uneven rhythm that made my eyes hurt. And then I heard it, a soft, lilting melody drifting down the stairs. It sounded like a music box? But the Thompsons didn't own a music box, at least not one that I'd ever seen. The tune was haunting, a slow, melancholy version of Rockabye Baby that made my skin crawl. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, from the direction of Lily's room. Lily, Chris, the kids. I had to check on them. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house. But I couldn't leave the children. Whatever was happening, whatever I was experiencing, I had to make sure they were safe. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking so badly I could barely walk. The music grew louder as I approached the stairs, the lights continuing their eerie dance of brightness and shadow. Each step up the staircase felt like an eternity. The music box melody echoed in my ears, growing louder and more distorted with each step. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, it had changed. What had started as a lullaby now sounded discordant and wrong, as if the music box was broken or playing backwards. The upstairs hallway was dark. the nightlight now flickering weakly. Shadows seemed to move and writhe on the walls, cast by nothing I could see. The air felt thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I moved towards Lily's room first, drawn by the music that seemed to be emanating from behind her closed door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, so cold it almost burned. I pushed the door open, holding my breath. Lily's room was bathed in an unnatural bluish light. The bedside lamp was off, but there was a glow coming from somewhere. It took my eyes a moment to adjust, to make sense of what I was seeing. Lily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the far corner of the room where a small antique music box sat on her dresser. A music box I had never seen before. The lid of the box was open, and a tiny ballerina figure spun slowly inside. This was the source of the music, the haunting melody that now filled the room. But how? Where had it come from? "Lily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the music. "Lily, honey, are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even blink. It was as if she was in some kind of trance. I moved closer to her bed, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Lily, please, you're scaring me. Say something." As my hand made contact with her, several things happened at once. The music stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie silence. The blue glow intensified, becoming almost blinding, and Lily's head snapped around to look at me. But the eyes that met mine weren't Lily's. They were black, endless pits of darkness that seemed to go on forever. And when she opened her mouth to speak, the voice that came out wasn't hers either. "She's ours now," the thing that wasn't Lily said, in a voice that sounded like many voices speaking at once. "And soon you will be too." I stumbled backwards, a scream tearing from my throat. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. I turned to run, to get help, to do something. But as I reached the doorway, I came face to face with the little girl I'd seen earlier. She stood there, blocking my exit, her pale face twisted into a grotesque smile that was far too wide for her small face. "Where are you going, Emily?" she asked, her voice a sickly sweet sing-song. "The fun is just beginning." I felt the world spin around me, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the little girl's face, those dark, empty eyes boring into mine. And then, mercifully, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally came to, I was lying on the floor of Lily's room, the cold hardwood pressing against my cheek. For a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The ghostly girl, the music box, Lily's black eyes. I sat up with a gasp, my heart pounding. The room was dark now, the eerie blue glow gone. The music box sat innocently on the dresser, closed and silent. And Lily? Lily was asleep in her bed, looking for all the world like nothing had happened. Had it all been a dream, some kind of stress-induced hallucination? I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky. I had to check on Chris. I had to make sure he was okay. As I moved towards the door, a floorboard creaked under my foot. I froze, watching Lily anxiously. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and continued to the door. The hallway was dark and quiet, too quiet. The storm outside seemed to have stopped, or at least paused. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I made my way to Chris's room, pushing the door open slowly. Relief washed over me as I saw him, still fast asleep in his bed. Whatever was happening, at least he seemed unaffected. I was about to close the door when something caught my eye. There on Chris's desk was a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. My curiosity overrode my fear, and I found myself moving towards it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in crayon. My blood ran cold as I saw what it depicted. It was a crude representation of the Thompson house. In front of it stood 4 stick figures, clearly meant to be Chris, Lily, Mrs. Thompson, and me. But behind us, looming over the house, was a fifth figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly arms that reached down towards the human figures. Its face was a black scribble, with 2 white circles for eyes. At the bottom of the page, in childish handwriting, were the words, "He's coming for us, Emily." My hand shook as I put the drawing down. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was very, very wrong in this house. I turned to leave the room, to wake the kids and get us all out of here. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I turned around. Chris was sitting up in bed. But it wasn't Chris. Not really. His eyes glowed an unnatural red in the darkness, and when he opened his mouth, I saw rows of sharp, pointed teeth. "Where are you going, Emily?" he asked, in a voice that was definitely not his own. It was deep, gravelly, and filled with malice. "Don't you want to play with us?" I screamed, yanking the door open and bolting into the hallway. I could hear something pursuing me, its footsteps heavy and fast behind me. I ran for the stairs, my only thought to get out of the house. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I skidded to a halt. The little girl in the white nightgown was there, blocking my path. She smiled up at me, that too wide grin splitting her face. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely. "But we're just getting started." I felt a presence behind me and spun around. The thing that looked like Chris was there, its red eyes gleaming in the darkness. And next to it, Lily, or what had once been Lily. Her golden curls were now matted and tangled, her sweet face twisted into a mask of malevolence. They advanced on me slowly, backing me up against the railing of the stairs. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, terror making my voice shake. The 3 figures spoke in unison, their voices blending into a horrifying chorus. "We want you, Emily. We want your fear, your pain, your soul." I felt the railing give way behind me, rotted wood crumbling under my weight. As I fell backwards, time seemed to slow down. I saw the triumphant grins on the faces of the things that had once been Chris and Lily. I saw the ghostly girl's eyes, black pits of nothingness. And behind them all, I saw a tall, shadowy figure, its long arms reaching out towards me. Then I was falling, tumbling down the stairs in a whirlwind of pain and terror. The last thing I heard before everything went black was that awful, discordant music box melody. I awoke to the sound of someone calling my name. "Emily, Emily, can you hear me?" The voice sounded distant, muffled, as if I was underwater. I struggled to open my eyes, my whole body aching. When I finally managed it, I found myself looking up at Mrs. Thompson's worried face. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. "I was about to call an ambulance. What happened?" I blinked, trying to make sense of my surroundings. I was lying at the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Thompson kneeling beside me. The house was quiet, normal, no sign of the horrors I had experienced. I don't know," I mumbled, wincing as I tried to sit up. I must have fallen down the stairs. Mrs. Thompson helped me to my feet, her brow furrowed with concern. "You're lucky you didn't break your neck. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe we should get you checked out at the hospital." I shook my head, instantly regretting it as pain lanced through my skull. "No, I'm fine. Just a bit bruised, I think." I paused, hesitating before asking the question I was dreading the answer to. How are the kids?" "Fast asleep," Mrs. Thompson replied. "I just checked on them. They didn't even stir when I came in." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by confusion. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of nightmare brought on by hitting my head? But it had felt so real. The music box, the ghostly girl, the twisted versions of Chris and Lily. I could still hear their voices, still see their distorted faces. "Emily?" Mrs. Thompson's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you sure you're all right? You look pale." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, really. Just a bit shaken up. I think I just need some rest." She didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. "All right, if you're sure. Let me drive you home at least." I agreed, grateful for the offer. As we walked to her car, I couldn't help but glance back at the house. It looked normal, peaceful even, but for a split second I could have sworn I saw a pale face watching us from an upstairs window. I shuddered and quickly looked away. It was over. It had to be over. The drive home was a blur. Mrs. Thompson's concerned questions washed over me, and I answered on autopilot, my mind still reeling from the night's events. When we pulled up in front of my house, she insisted on walking me to the door. "Get some rest," she said, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "And please, call me if you need anything. I feel terrible about this." I assured her I would be fine and watched as she drove away. As soon as she was out of sight, I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands. I needed to get inside, to be somewhere safe and familiar. But as I pushed open the front door, I froze. There, sitting on the hall table, was a small antique music box, the same music box I had seen in Lily's room. And as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, its lid slowly began to open. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the music box, its lid slowly creaking open. The familiar, haunting melody began to play, filling the quiet hallway with its eerie notes. I wanted to run, to slam the door and flee into the night, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. As the music played, the air around me grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being a warm summer night. The lights in the hallway flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then I saw her. The little girl in the white nightgown appeared at the top of the stairs, her pale face emotionless as she stared down at me. Slowly, deliberately, she began to descend, one step at a time. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "This isn't real. You're not real." The girl's lips curled into that too-wide smile I remembered from the Thompson house. "Oh, Emily," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the hallway. "I'm as real as your fear, as real as your guilt." "Guilt?" I repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" She reached the bottom of the stairs, standing just a few feet away from me. "You know what I mean, Emily. Think back. Remember." Suddenly my head was filled with flashes of memory. But they weren't memories I recognized. I saw myself, younger, maybe 10 or 11, playing with a little girl I didn't know. We were by a lake, laughing and splashing in the shallows. Then the scene changed. The little girl was struggling in deeper water, calling for help. And I was just watching from the shore, doing nothing. "No," I gasped, shaking my head violently. "That's not real. That never happened." "Didn't it?" the ghost girl asked, tilting her head to one side. "Are you sure, Emily? Or have you just buried it so deep you can't remember?" I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block out her voice, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" The girl's smile widened, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. "I want you to remember, Emily. I want you to face what you've done, and then I want you to join us." As she spoke, more figures appeared behind her. I recognized the twisted versions of Chris and Lily, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. And behind them, towering over all, was the tall, shadowy figure I had glimpsed before. Its long arms reached towards me, fingers elongating into sharp claws. I stumbled backwards, my back hitting the front door. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I was trapped. The ghost girl took another step towards me, the others following in her wake. "It's time, Emily," she said, her voice now a chorus of many. "Time to pay for your sins." As they advanced, the music from the box grew louder, more distorted. The walls of the hallway seemed to warp and twist, reality bending around us. I could feel the darkness pressing in, threatening to swallow me whole. In that moment of utter terror, a small, rational part of my brain sparked to life. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination. I squeezed my eyes shut, concentrating with all my might. "Wake up," I muttered to myself. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." I opened my eyes. The hallway was empty. The music box was gone. Everything was normal. For a split second, relief washed over me, but then I heard it. A soft giggle from upstairs, the creak of a floorboard. They were still here, still waiting, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this was far from over. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, seeing shadows move in every corner. My parents were worried, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was happening. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. I avoided the Thompsons, making excuses when Mrs. Thompson called to check on me. The thought of facing Chris and Lily, of not knowing if I'd see their normal faces or those twisted demonic versions, was more than I could bear. But I couldn't avoid the questions that plagued me. Who was the ghost girl? Why was she haunting me? And those memories she'd shown me, were they real? Had I really let a little girl drown? I needed answers, and I knew I wouldn't find them by hiding in my room. So, on the fourth day after that terrifying night, I forced myself to leave the house. My destination, the local library. If there was any information about hauntings, about the history of our town, I'd find it there. The library was quiet when I arrived, only a few patrons browsing the shelves. I made my way to the local history section, my eyes scanning the titles. Nothing jumped out at me immediately, so I settled in for a long search. Hours passed as I pored over old newspapers, town records, and historical accounts. My eyes were strained, my head aching, but I couldn't stop. I needed to find something, anything that might explain what was happening to me. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. It was a small article in a newspaper from 1952. The headline read, "Local Girl Drowns in Tragic Accident." My heart pounded as I read the details. A 10-year-old girl had drowned in Lake Hollow, just outside of town. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. But it was the next paragraph that made my blood run cold. The article mentioned that Sarah had been playing with a friend when the accident occurred. The friend, who wasn't named due to her age, reportedly froze in panic and was unable to help. My hands shook as I stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article. It showed a smiling little girl with long dark hair. She was wearing a white dress. It was her, the ghost girl. As the realization hit me, the temperature in the library seemed to drop. The lights flickered, and I heard the faint strains of that haunting music box melody. "Remember now, Emily?" Sarah's voice whispered in my ear. I whirled around, but there was no one there. The other library patrons continued their browsing, oblivious to my panic. I gathered my things quickly, shoving the photocopy of the article into my bag. As I hurried towards the exit, I could have sworn I saw Sarah's reflection in every window I passed, her accusing eyes following me. Once outside, I gulped in the warm summer air, trying to calm my racing heart. I had answers now, but they only led to more questions. How could I have been the friend mentioned in the article? It happened in 1952, long before I was born. Was I somehow connected to that unnamed girl? Reincarnated, maybe? And more importantly, what did Sarah want from me now? As I walked home, lost in thought, I didn't notice the tall, shadowy figure watching me from across the street. I didn't see its long arms reach out as if trying to grasp me from afar, and I didn't hear its low, guttural growl of frustration as I unknowingly passed beyond its reach. But I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of being watched, and I knew, without a doubt, that my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The walk home from the library felt like the longest journey of my life. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I reached my house, I was a nervous wreck. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard it again. That soft, haunting melody. It was coming from inside the house. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open. The music box sat in the center of the living room, its lid open, the tiny ballerina spinning slowly. Around it stood Sarah, Chris, and Lily, or rather the ghostly versions of them that had been haunting me, and behind them, looming over all, was the tall, shadowy figure I'd glimpsed before. "Welcome home, Emily," Sarah said, her voice echoing strangely in the room. "Are you ready to face your past?" I swallowed hard, clutching the newspaper article in my hand. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How can I be responsible for something that happened before I was born?" Sarah's eyes flashed, and suddenly the room around us changed. We were no longer in my living room, but on the shores of a lake. The sun was shining, and I could hear the laughter of children playing. "Watch," Sarah commanded. I saw two girls playing in the shallows. One was clearly Sarah, and the other looked just like me, but younger. They were laughing, splashing each other, having fun. Then Sarah ventured out deeper, where the water reached her chest. "Come on," she called to the other girl, to me. "It's not that deep." But I could see the fear in the other girl's eyes. She shook her head, backing away. "I can't swim," she said. "I'm scared." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Don't be a baby. It's fine, see?" She ducked under the water, then came up spluttering. "Help!" she cried, her arms flailing. "I can't touch the bottom." The other girl, me, stood frozen on the shore, paralyzed with fear. I watched in horror as Sarah struggled, going under once, twice, and then not coming back up. The scene faded, and we were back in my living room. I felt sick, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I was just a child. I was scared." "Sorry doesn't bring me back," Sarah hissed. "Sorry doesn't give me the life I should have had." The shadowy figure behind her seemed to grow larger, its arms reaching towards me. I could feel the darkness pressing in, threatening to swallow me whole. But something inside me snapped. This wasn't right. This wasn't fair. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I was a child. I made a mistake. A terrible, tragic mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. I've carried that guilt with me, even if I didn't remember it consciously. But I won't let you punish me forever." I turned to Chris and Lily. "And you two. You're not really Chris and Lily. You're just manifestations of my fear and guilt. The real Chris and Lily are safe at home." The ghostly versions of the children flickered like a bad TV signal. I faced Sarah again. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. I truly am. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be better, to help others when they need it. And I have. I've dedicated my life to taking care of children, to making sure they're safe." As I spoke, I felt a warmth growing inside me. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat. "It's time to let go, Sarah," I said softly. "It's time for both of us to find peace." For a moment, Sarah's face contorted with rage, but then, slowly, her expression softened. The anger in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep sadness, and then acceptance. "You're right," she said, her voice no longer echoing. "It's time." The shadowy figure behind her let out a howl of frustration as it began to dissipate. Chris and Lily's ghostly forms faded away. And Sarah. Sarah smiled at me, a real smile this time, not the terrifying grin I'd seen before. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she too began to fade. The music box slowly closed, its melody fading into silence, and just like that I was alone in my living room. I sank to my knees, exhausted but relieved. It was over. Finally, it was over. In the days that followed, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wondered if it had all been some kind of vivid hallucination, brought on by stress and that fall down the stairs at the Thompsons. But deep down, I knew the truth. The experience had been real as the newspaper article I still had, documenting Sarah's tragic death all those years ago. I started seeing a therapist, working through the guilt and fear that had plagued me for so long. I told her everything, and to her credit, she didn't dismiss my story outright. Instead, she helped me find ways to cope, to forgive myself, and to move forward. I continued babysitting for the Thompsons and other families in the neighborhood, but now I approached it with a new perspective. Every child I cared for was precious, and I was determined to keep them safe. to be the protector I hadn't been able to be for Sarah. Sometimes, late at night, I thought I could hear the faint strains of that music box melody, but it no longer filled me with dread. Instead, it reminded me of the peace Sarah had finally found, and the peace I was slowly finding myself. The experience had changed me. There was no doubt about that. But as I stood on the shores of Lake Hollow one sunny afternoon, watching children play in the shallows under the watchful eyes of their parents, I realized something important. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. We can use our experiences, even the painful ones, to become better, stronger, more compassionate people. And as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw Sarah standing at the edge of the woods, smiling and waving goodbye. This time I smiled and waved back, knowing that both of us had finally found the peace we'd been searching for. Folklore is a curious thing, a tapestry of tales woven through time, stories that defy the erosion of generations. I've often wondered why some stories fade like whispers in the wind, while others burn eternal, their flames leaping from one storyteller to the next. In my years of studying and experiencing these tales, I've come to believe that for a story to truly become folklore, it must possess two crucial elements: a universal lesson, and perhaps more importantly, a kernel of truth. Oh sure, the details might get embellished over time, like an endless game of telephone played across decades or even centuries. But the core message, the fundamental truth at the heart of the tale, remains unchanged. It's this truth that we as listeners can feel resonating in our bones. It's what makes the story stick with us, following us home like a shadow we can't shake, demanding to be retold. There's something cathartic about saying these stories aloud, isn't there? It's as if by giving voice to our fears, we make them a little less real, a little less threatening. But deep down, we know better. We know that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more than just stories. I'd like to share with you a folktale from my neck of the woods, a story I grew up hearing, and one that, on a fateful night, became all too real for me. It's the tale of Looney's Bridge, and it's a story that has shaped my life in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. I grew up in a small town nestled in the heart of the Louisiana Bayou. It's the kind of place where the air is thick with humidity and mystery, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural world seems as thin and permeable as morning mist. Our town, Cypress Grove, was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where old stories were passed down like precious heirlooms. My grandfather, Old Jack we called him, was the keeper of these stories in our family. He was a tall, lean man with skin tanned and weathered from years of working outdoors. His eyes, though, were always bright and alive, especially when he was spinning one of his tales. I remember countless summer evenings spent on his wide front porch, the air heavy with the scent of magnolias and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas. As the sun would begin to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, Old Jack would settle into his favorite rocking chair, and we kids would gather around him, eager for a story. "Now y'all listen well," he'd always begin, his voice gravelly but warm. "This ain't no mere ghost story I'm about to tell. This here's truth with a little bit of bite to it." We'd lean in close, our eyes wide with anticipation. Even though most of us had heard the story of Looney's Bridge dozens of times before, there was something about the way Old Jack told it that made it feel new and thrilling every single time. "Many years ago," he'd continue, "there was a family that lived out in these parts. The Beaumonts, they were called. Good folks, hard-working. They'd been living out in the deep bayou for generations, but times were changing, and they decided it was time to move closer to town." Old Jack would pause here, taking a sip from the glass of sweet tea that was never far from his hand. We kids would wait, hardly daring to breathe, knowing what was coming next. It was a hot day in August when they started moving. "Hotter than a goat's butt in a pepper patch," he'd say with a wink. earning a few nervous giggles from us. They'd been hauling stuff back and forth all day long. The father, Big Jim Beaumont, he was driving their old pickup truck. His son, Little Jim, was riding shotgun. And in the back, perched right on top of all their furniture and belongings, was their daughter, Looney. "Why'd they call her Looney, Grandpa?" one of the younger kids would inevitably ask. Old Jack would smile, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Well, her real name was Luna, on account of she was born on a night when the moon was so big and bright, it looked like you could reach out and touch it. But everyone called her Looney, 'cause she was always singing and humming to herself, lost in her own little world. Sweet girl she was. Always had a smile on her face." He'd shake his head then, as if to clear away the memory. Anyway, they were making their final trip into town, crossing over that old bridge just down the way. He'd point down the road and we'd all nod. We knew the bridge he meant. Everyone in Cypress Grove did. It was the only way in or out of town, a rickety old structure that spanned the widest part of the bayou. "Now what happened next?" Old Jack would say, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing us to lean in even closer. Was just about the most awful thing you could imagine. We'd hold our breath even though we knew what was coming. As they were going over that bridge, the wind kicked up something fierce. It caught hold of one of them heavy pieces of furniture in the back of the truck. Some say it was an old wardrobe, others say it was a big mirror. Whatever it was, that wind just lifted it right up, like it was light as a feather. And poor little Looney, she was holding onto it, trying to keep it from flying away. Old Jack's eyes would grow distant here, as if he was seeing the scene play out before him. That piece of furniture went right over the side of the truck, and it took little Looney with it. As she went over, she got caught under the back tire of that truck. He'd pause here, letting the horror of the moment sink in. We kids would be hanging on his every word, our imaginations painting vivid, terrible pictures. "It took her head clean off," he'd say softly. "Sent it flying up and over the bridge, down into the dark waters of the bayou below." A collective shudder would run through us at this point. Some of the younger kids might start to cry, and Old Jack would give them a moment to collect themselves before continuing. "Now everyone knows it's bad business to bury a body that ain't complete," he'd say. "The spirit won't rest if it's not all together." So the whole town pitched in to help look for Looney's missing head. They searched that bayou for days, dragging the waters, combing the banks, but they never did find it. He'd lean back in his chair then, his eyes scanning our faces. And to this day, Looney's head has never been found. It's still out there somewhere at the bottom of those murky waters. And they say, his voice would drop even lower here, that if you cross Looney's bridge at night, you might just see her. She'll jump on your car looking for her head. And if you don't hurry up and drive across, well, she might just take yours to replace the one she lost. The silence that followed this pronouncement was always heavy, broken only by the continued buzzing of the cicadas and the creak of Old Jack's rocking chair. We'd all sit there, lost in thought, imagining poor Looney and her endless search for her missing head. But Old Jack wasn't done. He had one more story to tell, one that always sent shivers down my spine. "You know," he'd say, as if the thought had just occurred to him, "my old farmhand Ike had a run-in with Looney's ghost once." This was the part of the story that changed slightly each time he told it. Sometimes Ike would see Looney's ghostly form in his rearview mirror. Other times he'd feel cold, wet hands grabbing at his neck. But the version that stuck with me the most, the one that would haunt my dreams for years to come, went like this. "Ike was a superstitious sort," Old Jack would begin. "Lived on the other side of Looney's bridge, and he had to cross it every day to get to and from my farm. Knowing how scared Ike was of crossing that bridge at night, and knowing he had a good 3-mile walk home, I started letting him take the tractor home in the evenings. Figured it'd help him cross the bridge faster and ease his nerves a bit." Old Jack would lean forward here, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. "One night, Ike was heading home from the farm. It was a dark night, no moon to speak of. He was about halfway across Looney's bridge when the tractor started to putter and grind. Then it just up and died right there in the middle of the bridge. We'd all be on the edge of our seats at this point, dreading what was coming next, but unable to look away. Ike kept trying to start it up, but that tractor was dead as a doornail. He told me later that he felt it in the air first, said the air felt charged, like electricity was surging all around him. His skin got all tight, and his hair started standing on end. Old Jack would pause here, building the tension. Then the tractor gave a big bounce, like something huge had just jumped on it. Ike said he felt what he described as hundreds of spider webs falling around his neck, slithering and crawling up towards his face. I remember feeling my own skin crawl at this part, fighting the urge to brush away imaginary cobwebs. That's when he smelled it, the dank, rotten smell of swamp mud. As that sensation spread across his cheeks, his vision started to blur, like lines of something were covering his eyes. He knew then and there that it was Looney, come to claim another head for her collection. Old Jack's voice would drop to barely above a whisper. Ike. He jumped off that tractor and ran as fast as his legs could carry him. Didn't stop running till he reached the end of that bridge. When he finally turned around, he swears he saw the tractor bounce up and down again, like something had just jumped off it. He'd sit back in his chair then, letting out a long breath. Ike quit his job at my farm the very next day. Wouldn't even go back out there in broad daylight to get the tractor. I had to go fetch it myself. And with that, old Jack's story would come to an end. We'd all sit there in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. Eventually, our parents would call us home, and we'd scatter into the gathering darkness, each of us casting nervous glances over our shoulders, half expecting to see Looney's headless form lurking in the shadows. As a child, I loved these stories. I'd beg old Jack to tell them over and over again, thrilling in the delicious fear they inspired. But as I grew older, that childhood fear of Looney and her bridge began to fade, lost in the familiarity of repetition. The legend became mundane, just another local tall tale. Little did I know that one day, the legend would show me just how real it could be. Fast forward a few years. I was 17, caught in that strange limbo between childhood and adulthood, too old to believe in ghost stories, but not quite old enough to admit that the world might hold more mysteries than I understood. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, that last golden summer of childhood when anything seemed possible and consequences felt like a distant concern. My friends and I had fallen into the habit of sneaking out late at night, borrowing, or to be honest, stealing my dad's golf cart for joyrides around town. We had a hangout spot, a sort of clubhouse in the loft of my buddy Mike's dad's old barn. We decorated it with all sorts of trophies from our nighttime excursions, road signs, mailbox flags, even a traffic cone or two. It was our own little kingdom, a place where we felt like kings of our small town world. One sweltering afternoon in late August, we were all sprawled out in the loft, trying to escape the heat and contemplating the rapidly approaching end of summer vacation. The air was thick and sticky, heavy with the scent of hay and the distant rumble of an approaching thunderstorm. "Man, I can't believe school starts next week," groaned Tyler, tossing a tennis ball against the wall and catching it with a rhythmic thump-thump. This summer went by way too fast. There were murmurs of agreement from around the loft. We were all feeling that peculiar mix of excitement and dread that comes with the end of summer and the start of a new school year. "We should do something," said Mike suddenly, sitting up from where he'd been lying on an old couch. "Something big, you know, to end the summer with a bang." We all perked up at that. Mike was known for his wild ideas, and they usually led to some of our most memorable adventures, and occasionally our most spectacular disasters. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, curiosity piqued. Mike's eyes glittered with mischief. "I was thinking, what if we got a sign from Looney's bridge?" The silence that followed was heavy. broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. We all knew the stories about Looney's Bridge. Hell, we'd grown up with them. But actually going out there in the middle of the night to take a sign, that was a whole different level of crazy. Are you nuts? Tyler was the first to break the silence. That's just asking for trouble. Come on, Mike scoffed. Don't tell me you actually believe those old ghost stories. It's just a bridge. I don't know, man, said Jamie, our resident worrier. Even if the ghost stuff isn't real, that bridge is old as dirt. What if it collapses or something? Mike rolled his eyes. It's not going to collapse. Cars drive over it every day. Besides, he added with a grin, we wouldn't be taking a car. We'd be on foot, in and out, quick and quiet. I had been quiet up to this point, turning the idea over in my mind. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, not because I believed in ghosts. I was far too mature for that, or so I thought, but because it felt disrespectful somehow, like we'd be crossing a line. But there was another part of me, a part that craved excitement and adventure, that was already imagining how cool that sign would look hanging in our loft. And if I was being honest with myself, there was a small secret part of me that wondered, what if the stories were true? What if we saw something out there? I'll do it, I heard myself say before I'd fully made up my mind. All eyes turned to me. Mike's face split into a wide grin. Really? You're in? I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Yeah, I'm in. Someone's got to keep you idiots out of trouble, right? There were laughs at that, the tension in the room breaking. Soon we were all talking over each other, planning the details of our midnight heist. We should do it tonight, Mike said, before we lose our nerve. Tonight? Jamie looked nervous. I don't know. No, Mike's right, I found myself saying. If we wait, we'll just talk ourselves out of it. Tonight's perfect. There's no moon, so it'll be dark. Less chance of getting caught. We spent the next few hours planning. We decided that Mike and I would be the ones to actually go to the bridge. Tyler would be our lookout, stationed at the start of the road leading to the bridge, ready to warn us if any cars came our way. Jamie, still clearly uncomfortable with the whole idea, agreed to cover for us with our parents if anyone came looking. As the sun began to set, we went our separate ways to prepare. I headed home, my mind racing with a mix of excitement and apprehension. What had I gotten myself into? Dinner with my family that night was a surreal experience. I picked at my food, barely tasting it, my thoughts consumed with what was to come. My parents must have noticed something was off, but they chalked it up to preschool jitters and didn't press the issue. As I lay in bed that night, waiting for the house to fall silent, I found myself thinking about old Jack's stories. I could almost hear his voice, gravelly and ominous. And they say if you cross Looney's Bridge at night, you might just see her. She'll jump on your car, looking for her head. And if you don't hurry up and drive across, well, she might just take yours to replace the one she lost. I shook my head, trying to dispel the memory. It was... As the old grandfather clock in our hallway chimed midnight, I slipped out of bed, fully dressed. I'd been lying there for hours, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake my parents. But the house remained silent as I crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step from the bottom. I'd packed a backpack with some basic tools, a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, and a small crowbar. I wasn't sure what kind of fasteners held the bridge signs in place, but I wanted to be prepared. I also threw in a flashlight, and after a moment's hesitation, the pocket knife my grandfather had given me for my 16th birthday. Every man needs a good knife, he'd said. I doubted this was the kind of use he'd had in mind. The night air was thick and humid as I slipped out the back door. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon had passed, leaving behind a sticky residue that clung to my skin. Cicadas droned in the darkness, their rhythmic buzzing a constant backdrop to the night. I made my way to the old shed where we kept the golf cart. My hands shook slightly as I unplugged it from the charger and climbed in. The familiar whine of the electric motor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night as I backed out of the shed and headed down our long driveway. The streets of Cypress Grove were deserted at this hour. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from every darkened window, every shadowy porch. Twice I nearly turned back, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. But each time I forced myself to continue. I couldn't back out now. What would my friends think? I met Mike at the agreed-upon spot, a bend in the road about a quarter-mile from Looney's Bridge. He was already there, pacing nervously in the shadows of a large oak tree. "You're late," he hissed as I pulled up. I checked my watch. "By like 2 minutes," I whispered back, climbing out of the golf cart. "Relax, man." But I could understand his nervousness. Now that we were here, the reality of what we were about to do was sinking in. This wasn't just another prank or joyride. This felt different, dangerous. We left the golf cart hidden behind some bushes and continued on foot. The road to the bridge was dark, the trees on either side forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow what little starlight there was. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached the bridge, I saw Tyler's form materialize out of the darkness. He was supposed to be our lookout, stationed at the start of the bridge road. "All clear," he whispered as we drew near. "No cars for the last hour." I nodded, trying to ignore the way my heart was hammering in my chest. "Keep your eyes peeled," I said, "and remember the signal if you see headlights." Tyler nodded solemnly. We'd agreed that if he saw a car coming, he'd flash his flashlight 3 times in quick succession. It seemed like a good system in the safety of Mike's barn. Now I wasn't so sure. Mike and I continued on, leaving Tyler behind. The bridge loomed before us, a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky. As we stepped onto the wooden planks, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold, moving from the world of the mundane into something else. The bridge creaked and groaned under our feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the still night air. Each step felt like it might be the one to alert someone or something to our presence. "There," Mike whispered, pointing ahead. In the dim light, I could just make out the reflective surface of a sign. It was one of those yellow and black striped markers that indicated the edge of the bridge. We approached cautiously, our eyes darting around, checking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the bridge, the sign, and the dark water below. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do this." I shrugged off my backpack and pulled out the screwdriver and pliers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them. Mike took the flashlight and shone it on the sign, giving me just enough light to work by. The screws holding the sign in place were old and rusted. They squealed in protest as I tried to turn them, the sound echoing across the water. I winced at each noise, sure that at any moment we'd hear sirens or shouts. But nothing happened. Slowly, painstakingly, I worked the screws loose. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the sign came free in my hands. "We did it," Mike breathed, a note of disbelief in his voice. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I quickly shoved the sign into my backpack along with the tools. "Let's get out of here," I said. We turned to go, both of us eager to be off the bridge. That's when I felt it, a change in the air, a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. But then the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on us. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath suddenly visible in front of me. "Mike," I said, my voice tight with fear, "do you feel that?" He nodded, his eyes wide in the beam of the flashlight. "We need to go. Now." We started to run, our footsteps thundering on the wooden planks, but it felt like we were running through molasses, each step requiring enormous effort. The bridge seemed to stretch out before us, growing longer with each stride. And then we heard it, a sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a low moan, barely audible over the pounding of our feet and our ragged breathing. But it grew louder, rising to a keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Don't look back," I yelled to Mike. though I'm not sure he could hear me over that terrible noise. But of course, I looked back. I couldn't help myself. What I saw in that moment is burned into my memory forever. There, in the middle of the bridge where we had just been standing, was a figure. It was small, child-sized, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress. But where its head should have been, there was nothing. Just a ragged stump of a neck, dark liquid glistening in the faint light. As I watched, frozen in horror, the figure began to move. Not walking, but gliding, floating towards us with unnatural speed. And as it came, I saw something forming above its neck. A shape, hazy and indistinct at first, but rapidly solidifying into a head. But it wasn't a human head. It was wrong, distorted. The features were twisted and melted, like a wax figure left out in the sun. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They were black pits, endless and hungry, fixed directly on me. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as coming from my own throat. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life, grabbing Mike's arm and dragging him with me. We burst off the bridge and onto solid ground, not stopping until we reached the golf cart. Tyler was there, his face pale with fear. "What happened?" he asked. I heard something, but we didn't stop to explain. We piled into the golf cart and I gunned the engine, not caring about the noise anymore. As we sped away, I risked one last glance back at the bridge. The figure was standing at the edge, right where the bridge met the road. It raised one arm, pointing directly at us, and even from this distance I could see its mouth, if you could call it that, opening in a silent scream. We didn't speak as we raced back through town. We didn't need to. We all knew that something had happened on that bridge, something that defied explanation, something that would change us forever. When we finally reached Mike's house, we sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice shaky. We don't tell anyone about this. Agreed?" Tyler and I nodded. Who would believe us anyway? As I drove home alone, the stolen sign a heavy weight in my backpack, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that by taking that sign we had set something in motion, something that wouldn't rest until it had what it wanted. I've never been back to Looney's Bridge since that night. I've never told anyone what we saw, what we experienced. But sometimes late at night I swear I can hear that keening wail carried on the wind. And in my dreams I see those black, empty eyes staring into my soul. The legend of Looney's Bridge, it turns out, is more than just a story, and I'll carry the truth of it with me for the rest of my days. The days following our encounter on Looney's Bridge passed in a blur of nervous glances and hushed conversations. Mike, Tyler, and I found ourselves huddled together between classes, speaking in low voices about what we'd experienced. Each of us had slightly different memories of that night, but we all agreed on one thing. What we'd seen was real, and it was far from over. Jamie, who had been our alibi that night, could sense that something was off. "What happened out there?" he kept asking, his eyes darting between us. But we stuck to our pact of silence, brushing off his questions with vague answers and forced laughter. The stolen sign lay hidden in my closet, wrapped in an old blanket. I couldn't bring myself to hang it in our loft as we'd originally planned. Every time I thought about it, I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the unearthly wail in those horrible empty eyes. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself plagued by nightmares. In my dreams, I was back on that bridge, but this time I was alone. The headless figure would appear, always just out of reach, its arm outstretched towards me. I'd try to run, but my feet would be rooted to the spot. And then slowly, agonizingly, the figure would start to form a new head. But it was never its own head. Sometimes it was Mike's, sometimes Tyler's, and sometimes, most terrifyingly, it was mine. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of that unearthly scream still ringing in my ears. More than once, my parents came to check on me, worried by my cries in the night. I brushed off their concern, blaming the nightmares on stress about the new school year. but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't guess what. School started, and with it came a welcome distraction from our nocturnal adventure. But even as I threw myself into my studies and extracurricular activities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a small, shadowy figure. But when I'd turn to look, there would be nothing there. Mike and Tyler were experiencing similar phenomena. Mike confided that he'd started seeing a strange, childlike reflection in mirrors and windows. Tyler, always the most high-strung of our group, had developed a nervous tic, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting to see something or someone following him. As September gave way to October, the atmosphere in Cypress Grove began to change. There was a chill in the air that seemed to come from more than just the changing seasons. People in town started talking about strange occurrences, unexplained noises in the night, objects moving on their own, glimpses of a small, shadowy figure darting between houses. Old Jack's stories about Looney's Bridge, which had been little more than quaint local folklore for years, suddenly took on a new life. People who had scoffed at the legend for years were now speaking of it in hushed, serious tones. More than once I overheard conversations at the local diner or grocery store, people swapping their own eerie experiences or second-hand accounts of ghostly encounters. The bridge itself became a topic of intense speculation. There were rumors that the county was considering closing it for structural assessments, but everyone knew the real reason. No one wanted to cross that bridge anymore, especially not at night. As Halloween approached, the tension in town reached a fever pitch. It was as if everyone could sense that something was coming, something big. The usual excitement for the holiday was tinged with a current of fear, an undercurrent of dread that seemed to permeate every festive decoration and planned celebration. For Mike, Tyler, and me, the approach of Halloween brought a new level of anxiety. We couldn't shake the feeling that we had set something in motion that night on the bridge, something that was building to a crescendo. We found ourselves drawn back to Mike's loft, spending long hours there after school, theorizing about what might happen and what we should do. It was during one of these sessions, about a week before Halloween, that Mike brought up the idea that would change everything. "We have to go back," he said suddenly, breaking a long silence. Tyler and I stared at him in disbelief. "Back where?" Tyler asked, though we all knew the answer. "To the bridge," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to put the sign back." I felt my stomach drop at the mere thought of returning to Looney's Bridge. But deep down, I knew Mike was right. Whatever we had stirred up that night, whatever force we had awakened, it wasn't going to rest until we made things right. "When?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Mike met my eyes, his expression grim. "Halloween night, it has to be then. The veil between worlds is thinnest on Halloween. If we're going to have any chance of fixing this, that's when we need to do it." Tyler looked like he might be sick. "This is insane," he muttered. "We can't go back there. You saw what happened last time." "That's exactly why we have to go back," I found myself saying. "We started this. We have to finish it." And so, with a mixture of determination and dread, we began to plan our return to Looney's Bridge. As we talked into the night, laying out the details of our Halloween mission, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were planning something more than just the return of a stolen sign. It felt like we were preparing for a battle, one that would determine not just our fates, but perhaps the fate of our entire town. Little did we know just how right that feeling would turn out to be. The week leading up to Halloween was the longest of my life. Each day seemed to drag on endlessly, the hours ticking by with agonizing slowness. At night, my dreams were filled with visions of Looney's Bridge, of ghostly figures and grasping hands emerging from the dark waters below. In school, Mike, Tyler, and I moved through the halls like zombies, exhausted from lack of sleep and weighed down by the knowledge of what we were planning to do. Our friends noticed the change in us, of course. How could they not? We were shadows of our former selves, jumping at every sudden noise, flinching at every unexpected touch. "What's wrong with you guys?" Jamie asked one day at lunch, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "You've been acting weird ever since school started." We exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between us. We couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it anyway. But maybe we could tell him part of it. "We're going back to Looney's Bridge on Halloween night," I said finally, my voice low. Jamie's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you insane after what happened last time?" We hadn't told him the details of our first trip to the bridge, but he knew something had gone wrong. He'd seen the change in us, had probably guessed that we'd experienced something we couldn't or wouldn't talk about. "We have to," Mike said, his voice firm despite the tremor I could detect underneath. We took something that night. We need to put it back." Jamie looked at each of us in turn, his expression a mixture of fear and concern. "Let me come with you," he said finally. "No," Tyler and I said in unison. "This is our mess," I added. "We need to clean it up ourselves." Jamie didn't look happy about it, but he nodded, accepting our decision. "Just be careful, okay? There's been talk around town, strange things happening. People are saying it's not safe out there, especially at night." We nodded grimly. We knew all too well how unsafe it could be. As Halloween approached, the atmosphere in Cypress Grove grew increasingly tense. The usual excitement for the holiday was muted, overshadowed by a sense of foreboding that seemed to hang over the town like a heavy fog. Parents were keeping their children close, and there was talk of canceling the traditional Halloween parade and trick-or-treating. The day before Halloween, I overheard a conversation between my parents that made my blood run cold. "I don't like it, John," my mother was saying, her voice tight with worry. "There's something not right about this Halloween. Maybe we should keep the kids home tomorrow night." "Now, Mary," my father replied, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "It's probably just all this ghost talk getting to everyone. You know how people get around this time of year." "It's not just talk," my mother insisted. "Mrs. Johnson swears she saw something in her backyard last night. A small figure," she said, "just standing there watching her house. And when she blinked, it was gone." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mrs. Johnson lived just 2 houses down from us. "And that's not all," my mother continued. "The Petersons' dog won't stop barking at night, always facing the direction of the bridge. And little Timmy Walsh, he's been having night terrors. Keeps screaming about a girl with no face trying to take him away." I'd heard enough. I crept back up to my room, my mind racing. It was clear that whatever we had awakened that night on the bridge wasn't content to stay there. It was spreading, reaching out into the town, touching everyone with its cold, spectral fingers. We had to put an end to this. We had to make things right. Halloween dawned gray and cold, a thin mist clinging to the ground and obscuring the distant tree line. At school there was none of the usual holiday excitement. The halls were quiet, the students subdued. Even the teachers seemed on edge, their lessons half-hearted and distracted. As the final bell rang, Mike, Tyler, and I met up outside the school. No words were needed. We all knew what we had to do. We went our separate ways to prepare, agreeing to meet at the edge of town at midnight. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from every shadow, every darkened window. The mist seemed to thicken around me, tendrils reaching out as if trying to hold me back. At home, I went through the motions of a normal evening. I picked at my dinner, barely tasting the food, my stomach churning with anxiety. My parents, caught up in their own worries, didn't seem to notice my distraction. As night fell, an unnatural silence descended on the town. There were no trick-or-treaters on the streets, no sounds of laughter or celebration. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In my room, I prepared for the night ahead. I dressed in dark clothes, sturdy boots on my feet. In my backpack, I placed a flashlight, extra batteries, and the stolen sign, still wrapped in its old blanket. As an afterthought, I added the pocket knife my grandfather had given me. I didn't know if it would be any use against a ghost, but its familiar weight was comforting. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I slipped out of my window and down the trellis on the side of the house. The mist had thickened into a dense fog, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint, musty smell that reminded me of old basements and forgotten attics. I made my way through the deserted streets, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. As I neared the edge of town, I saw two familiar figures emerge from the fog. Mike and Tyler, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. "Ready?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tyler and I nodded, not trusting ourselves to speak. And so, with heavy hearts and shaking hands, we set off towards Looney's Bridge, the fog swallowing us up as we left the safety of the town behind. The walk to the bridge seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. The fog muffled all sound, creating a bubble of silence around us that was broken only by our labored breathing and the soft crunch of our footsteps on the gravel road. As we neared the bridge, the air grew colder, our breath coming out in visible puffs. The fog seemed to thin slightly, allowing us to see the dark outline of the bridge looming ahead of us. We paused at the foot of the bridge, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't help but remember the last time we stood here, full of misplaced bravado and foolish curiosity. How naive we had been, how unprepared for the consequences of our actions. "Okay," Mike said, breaking the silence. "Let's do this." With shaking hands, I pulled the sign from my backpack. It felt heavier than I remembered, as if it had absorbed some of the supernatural energy that surrounded this place. We stepped onto the bridge, the old wood creaking ominously under our feet. Each step felt like a mile, every shadow seeming to move and shift in the corners of our vision. We were about halfway across when it happened. A sudden gust of wind swept across the bridge, cutting through our clothes and chilling us to the bone. The fog swirled and eddied, and in its dancing patterns, I swore I could see faces forming and dissolving. And then we heard it, that keening wail, the same unearthly sound we had heard on that fateful night. It started low, barely audible, but quickly rose in pitch and volume until it seemed to fill the entire world. "There!" Tyler shouted, pointing with a shaking hand. At the far end of the bridge, a figure was forming in the mist, small, childlike, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress, and where its head should have been, nothing. "Looney," I whispered, the name escaping my lips before I could stop it. At the sound of her name, the figure's head snapped up, or rather where its head should have been. It began to move towards us, not walking but gliding, its feet never seeming to touch the bridge. "The sign," Mike yelled over the howling wind. "We have to put it back." With fumbling hands, I raised the sign, trying to see where it had originally been attached. But the ghostly figure was getting closer, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. That's when I saw them, other shapes emerging from the fog on either side of the bridge. Adult figures, some tall and broad, others small and slight, all of them headless, all of them moving towards us with inexorable purpose. "Oh God," Tyler moaned, "there's more of them." I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. With shaking hands, I managed to position the sign where I thought it had been. Mike fumbled with the screwdriver, trying to secure it in place. The ghostly figures were closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. I could hear whispers now, carried on the wind, pleading voices, angry voices, all of them calling out for something, for their heads, I realized with a jolt of horror. Just as the first ghostly hand was about to reach us, Mike gave a cry of triumph. "It's done!" For a moment, nothing happened. The ghosts continued to advance, their empty necks swaying grotesquely as they moved. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, and then silence. I opened my eyes cautiously. The bridge was empty. The fog had cleared, and the night was still. No wind, no whispers, no ghostly figures. Just 3 terrified teenagers standing in the middle of an old wooden bridge. We looked at each other in disbelief, hardly daring to hope that it was over. And then from the distance we heard the town clock begin to chime. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. Midnight had passed. Halloween was over. We practically ran off the bridge, not stopping until we had reached the safety of the town. As we stood there gasping for breath, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We had done it. We had made things right. In the days that followed, life in Cypress Grove slowly returned to normal. The strange occurrences ceased and people began to relax. The legend of Looney's Bridge faded back into the realm of campfire stories and local folklore. But for Mike, Tyler, and me, things would never be quite the same. We had seen behind the veil, had glimpsed a world beyond our understanding, and while we never spoke of that night to anyone else, the memory of it stayed with us, a shared secret that bound us together for the rest of our lives. Years have passed since that Halloween night. I've left Cypress Grove, built a life elsewhere, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a faint, distant wail. And I remember the night we crossed Looney's Bridge and the terrible, wonderful truth we discovered there. For in Cypress Grove, as in many places, the line between legend and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, just sometimes, the stories we tell around campfires turn out to be more than just stories after all.